I'm Katie Tamlin, and welcome back to EcoDev. Today we are talking about pollinators, and particularly bees who produce honey.
There's growing scientific consensus that pollinator populations worldwide are declining overall. And while we don't have great time series data that shows us all types of populations of bees across all different types of bees, certainly some individual studies are demonstrating declines in bee populations. For example, in the UK, amongst the populations that are monitored, 70% of those have declined from 1980 to 2010. A flying biomass study carried out in Germany found that flying insects declined by 76 to 82%, depending on the season, between 1989 and 2016. And both cultivated bee and wild pollinator populations in the US are understood to be declining over time in recent decades.
So, what we need to understand is what are the things that are harming bee populations? Why are bees so important? Why do we need to keep them around? And then, how can we try to help improve those populations going forward? So, the two main things that we can control that are harming bee populations are the use of agrochemicals, i.e., pesticides. And there are a number of these pesticides that have been banned temporarily or permanently in the EU and in the UK. Many of those are still perfectly legal in the US. So there's certainly some work to do legislatively in the US to try to get in line. There's more to do, certainly in the UK and in the EU, to make sure that those chemicals are permanently banned so that bee populations can recover. But that's only part of the issue. Another significant contributing factor is loss of habitat. So in the UK, since World War II, we've lost 97% of our wildflower meadows, and those are critical bee habitats. As well, intensive agriculture practice where you have farming of kind of monocultural type farming where you have the same crop over a huge acreage that is harvested by machines. Well, that eliminates all the hedgerows that were previously fantastic nesting sites for bees and other pollinators, and so that's reducing habitat. And then finally, one that's slightly less in our control, but certainly is impacted by humans, is pests and pathogens, which are damaging bee populations. And there's emerging evidence that some of the agrochemicals in use that don't outright kill bees make them less able to fight some of those pests and pathogens. So there's kind of a double whammy happening there. So, right, we know these populations are declining. We know they're incredibly important for our agricultural industries. So it's estimated that between 235 and 577 billion US dollars of annual food production depends on pollinators, natural pollinators. So this has huge implications for food production. And, you know, if you want to think about it kind of in, okay, well, what does it mean for me? Just think, if we can't rely on natural pollinators and we have to bring in people or build machines to pollinate crops in future, well, that's going to make the cost of those crops and the yields, the amount of agricultural outputs we get per acre of land, it's going to make them fall, which means food's going to get more expensive. And that certainly is not a great place to be. We're already fighting really high inflation and seeing a lot of hunger and poverty across the globe. So we need food yields and decisions that support sustainable food yields to be moving in a positive direction, not sliding backwards, which this research suggests that it will do if we don't take action. So, what can you do when it comes to promoting bee populations? Well, there's some really simple things you can do. You can get what are called seed bombs these days. You can order them online, you can get them in shops, or you can make them yourself. But the key thing is spread wildflower seeds. The great thing about wildflowers is they're really good at growing wherever you throw them. So make some space in your garden for plants that attract bees if you have a garden. If you don't, you can certainly work in your local area, whether it's parks or other small green spaces. You know, planting wildflowers in those should be a no-brainer. Planting wildflowers along highways is a great way to use land that otherwise wouldn't really be used for anything more productive than that. My local council has just put a wildflower meadow in our village, and it's absolutely fantastic space for the dog, for the kids, for us to enjoy, and also fantastic reintroduction of habitats for those bees. The other thing you can do is support ecological farming. So by buying organic produce and supporting farmers who do not use those agrochemicals that are harmful to pollinator populations, we can help those populations recover. We can help ensure that there are safe spaces for those populations to recover. So those are two really simple things that you can do to help support the return of bee populations. There's also a slightly controversial debate happening about whether or not you should eat honey. So the Vegan Society states that honey, of course, being an animal product, is not considered part of a vegan diet, and that by eating honey, you are exploiting those animals, and that the bees starve when you take the honey out of the hive. Um, that is all true, accurate information, and certainly for vegans who do not eat honey, completely get it, completely support that. But there is a counter to that. Similar to the farming of livestock, I don't think my mom's chickens would do very well if she didn't feed them. And the same with cattle. I don't think they would do very well if we just let them out and let them free range. We feed the animals that are part of our agricultural supply chains in winter. And so with bees, the same thing happens. If you take honey out of the hive, and then the bees need more energy towards the end of the winter, if there's not enough for them to live, then bee farmers, responsible bee farmers feed their bees. So I think certainly while it's true that the bees would eat the honey, it's not always true that the bees would eat all of the honey that they produce. And it's certainly true that responsible farmers, feed their bees responsibly. And that's usually by topping up the hive with a sugar syrup. It's not, feeding them sugar syrup and taking all of their honey. So it's about finding balance with the agriculture practice, and making sure that we're responsible in the way that we farm bees. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking to my mom, who is a bee farmer, about what she's learned, and about some of the surprises and some of the fun adventures that she has had along the way in keeping bees.
So how many beehives do you have?
Oh, let's see. 3, 4, about 7 now that are active. I had 2 that are what we call dead outs that happened this summer.
What's a dead out?
A dead out is when you just all of a sudden either a queen dies or disappears, and they just are not. They die out. They go to another colony, whatever, or they're overtaken by, it could be varroa mite or hive beetles. They become so weak that they can't fight off the pests that are common.
So 7 now.
7 now, yeah.
And how did you come to have 7 beehives?
Well, we had a wonderful friend, Bobby Durham, who's a retired vet here, and he was a beekeeper, and he'd come out to visit us. His wife was my husband's cousin, and they grew up together and were very close. And he'd visit the farm and say, you need a beehive, you need a beehive. I said, okay. So he brought one, and I didn't pay any attention to it. And he just managed it and did everything and that was required. And then he had a stroke, and I thought, oh dear, I'm going to have to learn how to do this if I really want to do it. So we have a local beekeeping club, and we have been in the habit of having, pre-COVID, a workshop for new beekeepers every year, and it's a day-long workshop that sort of gets you off your, to a running start with the bees. There's a lot to know about beekeeping, and I have not even scratched the surface. But at any rate, I attended one of those, and then I have a wonderful friend, Mary Laxon in Sparta, who's just a wonderful woman, and she is my mentor. And whenever I have things I don't understand or I don't know what to do, and she also produces bee colonies and produces queens. So she's not only is she a good mentor, but she has everything I need to succeed if I have a problem. Mm-hmm. So, and plus she's a wonderful friend. So that's how I got started, kind of evolved.
And so it sounds really complicated, but what is involved? Like, how do you encourage bees to produce honey in the simplest terms? Like, what do they need to get started and to survive?
Well, they need a good workforce, fairly large colony. In Georgia, the nectar flow, which is the time that the bees can harvest nectar from plant sources and store it in their hive, is only 2 months in Piedmont, Georgia. Mm-hmm. So you have a very short window of opportunity as far as being able to harvest honey from a hive. So if you don't have a colony with a good workforce at the beginning of April, if you have just one that's failing or one that it's just a new colony, you won't get any honey that first year.
Mm-hmm.
And then they have to spend a year building up.
And I mean, there are plants blooming throughout the summer. So is that because it's specific?
They're extreme. This was the saddest revelation I ever realized, and I didn't know it until after I was a beekeeper. It goes to show you should educate yourself a little bit. But these bees are not native to our country. These are the European, Asian bees from that area of the country that colonists brought over. So they're very specific on the plants they'll forage. So like there are a few things, we call it the summer dearth. There are a few things they'll forage in the summer, but that's why I plant the buckwheat for them. So they'll have a little help to get through the summer, to get to the time when the goldenrod and asters bloom, which is in the fall. But mainly that foraging is their winter stores.
Okay.
So when they come to the end of winter, the hives are usually pretty depleted.
Mm-hmm.
And then they start again in February with the maple tree bloom. That's the first sign of spring here, and that's the first thing that the bees can harvest. So that was kind of a lot of our plants are pollinated by the multitude of, there's hundreds and hundreds of native bees that pollinate most of them.
Okay.
Or wasps, or ants, or flies, birds.
And do we not have honey producing bees that are native, or have they been knocked out?
We don't. It's a social, it has to be a social bee that lends itself. Well, they're producing honey for their own use, but it has to be a social bee that's inclined to be managed, in hives.
What does that mean? What does that entail?
It means that you provide a cavity, an artificial cavity.
Mm-hmm.
If they were in the wild in Europe, they would be in trees, in hollow trees. But we provide them with an artificial cavity with frames that have foundation on them in the right. Even if it didn't have foundation, they would build a honeycomb in there, but it'd be all erratic and it would be hard to harvest.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why you put the frames in with the foundation, so they'll build the cone in a way that's easy to harvest.
Mm-hmm.
So they're building the honeycomb on these frames, and then when the nectar is the right viscosity, they cap the honey, and that's when it's ready for harvest, either by humans or by themselves throughout the winter.
Okay.
And in the winter, they're in a cluster, staying warm, and they just migrate through the hive up to where the honey is. Or they have, if it's warm enough, they'll just send.
What would happen if you didn't harvest honey? Would it go to waste? Do they produce more than they consume?
Sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you want to leave them enough, like every hive I have has a brood chamber, and then an extra super above, which is a more narrow chamber. And that's where but I let them lay throughout that two chamber, the deep and the medium. And then I rotate it in the spring. That's a little more complicated, but so that's where the queen's laying her eggs. The workers are feeding the eggs, and they eventually cap it over, and the pupa develops under a cap and then hatches out.
In the brood chamber.
In the brood chamber. And that's, you want as many worker bees as you can right before the honey flow. And then they're all out. And then they'll start working up in the hive, and you put supers on top. And I put a queen excluder just to keep her down low so I don't have to look for her and she won't start laying up in the honey supers. And some people don't, but it's just easier for me. And then anything excess of those two lower chambers you can harvest.
Because they wouldn't consume it.
No, but you kind of, at the end of winter, I had to feed mine at the end of winter last winter because when I'd lift the hives, they were so light, they had depleted the stores.
Okay.
And I probably would have lost a few hives had I not fed them right at the end of winter.
Okay.
You just kind of have to monitor them at that end point to make sure they've got enough to get to the point where where there's natural stuff blooming for them to start storing up again.
So it's a balance in that you're harvesting honey, but if the bees run out of honey for them to eat, you're feeding them.
I'm feeding them.
And what do you feed them? Sugar water?
Sugar water. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I've got honey out there to be harvested. I will treat the bees for varroa mite, which is our main pest here, late summer, early fall. So I have until that point to take off the honey that I'm going to use or harvest, making sure I'm leaving enough down here for them. And you can change out the frames. Maybe they haven't filled out the frames in the whole box. So you could take one from that you're harvesting, put it down so they'll have it, and then just take maybe not the whole super, but just part of it. Yeah.
And what are
and it's delicious. Piedmont honey is delicious, but it's just such a short window. And then occasionally I have friends that have gone to the mountains and taken their bees up there in the summer for the sourwood bloom, which is very desirable. And you get, like I could do that if I had a trailer. And I could prolong the nectar flow by moving the hive around, is what I'm trying to say, according to what's blooming in other regions of the southeast. But,
and what does that do to the taste?
Oh, it's totally, whatever they foraged affects the taste of the honey, yes. Sourwood is delicious, and but the Piedmont is really delicious, and it's just a mix of wildflowers and maple, poplar, willow tree. Why can't I think of red, the rubrum, oh shoot. Anyway, just some of our native things are very, blackberries, blueberries. Yeah, the blueberries aren't native, but the blackberries makes great honey. That's a great honey source, which we have a lot of on the farm.
And is there a connection between, if they're European bees, are they still tied to the plants or similar plants to what they would forage on in Europe? Here, is that why it's so short, or is it just that they're specific? They've evolved.
I think it's an anatomical thing too. Sometimes they can't get their what's it called, the proboscis or something like that. I can't remember. It's anatomically problematic for them to forage certain things. But I don't know. That's it. Probably so. I mean, but I think it's an anatomical thing.
How often do you get stung?
Oh, I've gotten pretty blasé about it because I know it hurts initially really badly, and I have gotten do swell, but it's not often. Sometimes if I do pay the price if I'm a little careless, but it's never a problem.
What
and
hurts?
Sometimes they get up in your under your veil, and I've learned that the best thing to do, I hate to do it, is to kill it because you can't. You're not going to be able to get it out, get in and get it out.
What hurts worse, snake bite or honeybee sting?
Oh, well, I haven't ever been bitten by a venomous snake, but definitely honeybee
hurts worse than a non-venomous snake bite.
Yes,
wow,
definitely.
That is an interesting takeaway.
It hurts.
Yeah,
it hurts.
And so you do wear a full beekeeper suit?
Well, sometimes the bees are really placid. If it's during the nectar flow and they're happy and they're not hot, you can go in a hive. I could probably go in with what I'm wearing now and they wouldn't sting me. But you just never know what you're going to hit. And so it's good you at least need to have a top on. And then I backed away from hives. And if they're really unhappy. I mean, that it can be very intimidating. They get all over you. And even though you're protected, it's you can actually get stung through a suit sometimes.
Really?
Well, and I have gloves that have mesh on them, and I've been stung all that way too. So it's probably not good to get multiple stings. So you just kind of back away from that and say another day. I actually had I went into Bobby Durham's hive last summer at the end of a hot summer day, which was not smart, and the bees were all over me instantly and wouldn't leave me alone. They got on his little dog and killed it. It was a terrible thing. Yes, because the dog was elderly, and I think he just couldn't take that and that amount of toxin coming in. So that was pretty intimidating. And I walked all the way over to the clinic from his house, and they were still all over me. And I was all suited up, so I was okay. And the important thing to do, just if you're being attacked by bees, don't do this, because it makes it worse. It makes them worse. If you can just take a deep breath and calm yourself down and quietly walk away, that's the best thing you can do, as far away from the hive as you can get.
Yeah.
But
goodness. So grumpy bees sting.
Grumpy bees,
and they're
really
aggressive.
do. And often the bees that are grumpy and mean are the ones that make the most honey too. That's just anecdotal. I don't know that that's ever been proven scientifically. But
do you feel the full beekeeper suit is missing in modern fashion?
I do. I do indeed. There's great potential there.
And what's it like to manage a swarm? Well, what is a swarm? And then what is it like to manage one?
Oh, it's fun. It's fun. The bees in the spring, it's their reproductive technique. So they, in an effort to reproduce themselves, just like everything else is trying to do in the spring, a hive will, the old queen, the workers start making a new queen. And so the old queen will exit the hive as the new queen is being gestated. And with her, she will take sometimes 60% of the workforce, which is massively great, especially when you're coming on to the nectar flow, when you want to have your workforce in place.
So how many bees is that?
Oh.
Hundreds? Thousands?
Oh, thousands, yeah. Well, swarms can be different. There's primary swarms, secondary swarms, tertiary swarms. Sometimes they'll make more than one or two new queens, and they'll exit with some of them too. So that's another whole thing. But this is the primary swarm that leaves, and it's just a big ball of bees with the queen in the middle, the old queen in the middle, usually the old queen in the middle. And they've engorged themselves with honey. So they're very docile, believe it or not. It looks very intimidating to see a ball of bees capable of stinging the devil out of you. But it's not. So they're usually calm. And people can probably, it's not advisable, but experienced beekeepers probably would catch a swarm and maybe not suit up, but they should. But anyway, they'll hang. They send out scout bees to find another cavity in which to house themselves, and people actually put out empty hives to try to attract these swarms from their apiaries. So meanwhile, while they're hanging in this ball, either from a tree or sometimes they'll just aggregate on the side of a house, or where else do they go? But usually it's low hanging. Sometimes it'll be high hanging, but it's really easy to catch them.
How do you catch them?
Well, I just put the box that I'm going to put them in under them, and then you can either, if you can't, just knock them down, like by hitting a branch or something, and they just kind of fall, because the queen's in that middle, and they'll go wherever the queen is. The other workers will follow her. And if you get if you get the queen in the box with most of the workers, you just put the top on, sit it down, and leave it for several hours, and the others will just walk in there.
Wow.
It's pretty amazing to watch.
So let me get this straight. I have a mental image now of you in a full beekeeper suit with a box and thousands of bees in a tree, banging the branches of a tree to get the bees to go in.
Yeah, I have a friend who's a beekeeper who lives nearby, and he's a very adventuresome soul. And he came over. I had it was too big of a swarm. I mean, it was too high of a swarm, and we put him in the bucket, and he went up in the bucket and got the bees out. It was great.
Is there anything else you want to share about keeping bees, or good books that you would recommend for fledgling beekeepers?
Oh, well, anything Tom Seeley from Cornell has written is wonderful. The Beekeepers Democracy. It's just about the amazing social life they live inside the hive, and how the scout bees and how they tell each other. One bee will discover a good nectar source, and he'll come down and come back to the hive and do the special waggle dance that shows exactly where the nectar source is, and he communicates that to the other, and then they all go. It's amazing. They're amazing.
Cool.
Even though they're not native to America. That was very disappointing for me, but oh well, I've gotten over it.